So the end of the third pasuk describes HaKadosh Baruch Hu's response to our prayers. The beginning of that third pasuk, Vaynitzak al Hashem, Vayishma Hashem es koleinu, began to daven. This was the first time during the entire episode which Am Yisrael responded with some sort of prayer or initiative. Vaynitzak al Hashem Elokei Avoseinu. We began to cry out, and as the hagadah cites a pasuk in Shmos, we didn't cry directly to God. We cried and moaned and groaned from the workload, from the toil, from the suffering, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu translated those cries into prayer. Vayishma Hashem es koleinu. So God hears our voice, and again, the literal reading of the pasuk in Parshas Kisavo is that God heard our voices and responded to our tefillos. But the hagadah associates this pasuk in Kisavo, Vayishma Hashem es koleinu, or at least this phrase, with a very interesting parallel pasuk in Parsha Shmos. Vayishma Elokim es na'akasam. So just as in Kisavo, in Parsha Shmos, God listens to their voice, to their prayers. But Shmos provides the reason. Vayiskar Elokim es briso, es Avraham, es Yitzchak, ve'es Yaakov. God redeems us not necessarily because we deserve to be redeemed, but because He remembers a covenant, He remembers a promise, a bris with Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So the pasuk in Kisavo suggests that God listens to our prayers and redeems us based on our merit, based on our sincerity, based on our suffering. But the pasuk in Shmos provides a very, very different view. There was a bris avos, there was a covenant, there was a treaty, there was an arrangement made with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And even though we may not have deserved redemption because we sunk into paganism, because we're completely passive, because we hadn't taken any initiative in our own redemption, there was a bris, there was a treaty, there was a covenant. As Chazal interpret the pasuk in Shir Hashirim, called Odi Hineh Zeba Midaleg al Hearim Mekapetz al Hagvos, that God came rambling over the mountains, Midaleg al Hearim, which at a literal level is suggestive of the energy, of the excitement, of the passion, and the liberation from Egypt is not just about an emancipation of people and a launching of Jewish history, but a launching of a love affair between God and people. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes bounding over those mountains, as it were, at least in the metaphor of Shir Hashirim, of a lover and his wife. Midaleg al Harim also suggests the acceleration of Gula, that at some point HaKadosh Baruch Hu realized that if we were to languish in exile any longer, we may not have been redeemable. But according to Chazal, Midaleg al Harim also suggests that we may not have deserved it. God is skipping over us as beneficiaries, but redeeming us because of these harim and mountains, of course. These large, looming mountains always refer to, or at least very often refer to, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Or as the Medrash says, that the reason for sprinkling the blood on the mashkov, on the doorposts, and the shtei mezuzos, the top post and the two side posts, so the Gemara interprets, or the Medrash interprets, Mashkov, Ze Avraham, Shtei Mezuzos, Ze Yitzchak, Yaakov. So according to this version of the Haggadah, Hashem wasn't responding to our prayers as much as He was responding to a bris avos, to a covenant with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, again cementing the fact that we may not have been deserving of redemption, but were redeemed anyway, which may sound like a less than ideal or a compromised way to be redeemed, but is a very durable and powerful way to be redeemed. Even though we don't deserve it, there's a historical covenant, historical treaty that's more compelling than our own compatibility. So God listens to our voice, and especially the phrase koleinu in Kisavo. Doesn't say Vayishma Hashem es tfilaseinu, es na'akaseinu, es shavaseinu, es za'akaseinu. God didn't hear our moans, our groans, our prayers. He heard our voice, and that voice is a more generalized term. Our voice could be the voice of prayer. Our voice could be the voice of history, the voice of our ancestors. So even though the pasuk in Kisavo doesn't explicitly attribute HaKadosh Baruch Hu's receptivity to the avos, The employment of the term kolenu is suggestive that God isn't listening to our prayer, but listening to the avos, and certainly the corresponding pasuk, which the Haggadah cites, the pasuk, of course, not in Kisavo, but in Shmos, Vayiskar Elokim es Briso, as Abraham es Yitzchak v'es Yaakov. By the way, this conclusion, or at least resolution to the exile, is very, very similar to the solution of the first Tochacha B'Chukosai, where we've been exiled, the Beis HaMikdash has been destroyed. We're not yet really worthy of redemption, but v'zacharti lehem b'risi shonim asher tzesi osam v'zacharti b'risi Yaakov v'risi Yitzchak v'risi Avram Eskor, very famous psukim which we recite so often in Slichos, serves as the baseline for HaKadosh Baruch Hu is redeeming us. In any event, there's a second reason Hashem responds to our tefillos, even though we may not have deserved, because certain things about the torture and the punishment, the persecution in Egypt, which almost forced HaKadosh Baruch Hu to respond, even if we were religiously unsuitable, religiously undeserving of redemption. And that's the end of the pasuk in Kisava and Arami Ovid Avivayar, Sanyenu, Yesamolenu, Yizlachatzenu. There are three unique aspects, three particular aspects of the suffering, which, as it were, forced HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hand. Anyenu comes from the term oni, or ona, and the Haggadah at least interprets it as a separation of Jewish family life, a hindering of procreation, of marriage. Egyptians tried to muddle with the institution of Jewish marriage, the institution of Jewish family, whether it was stealing our wives, whether it was preventing childbearing. Very famous episode where even Amram, the father of Moshe, is so broken by the notion that his son will be fed to the crocodiles that he divorces his wife Yocheved, at least temporarily. Why should he bring a child into this nightmarish world? And Miriam has to restore his confidence, the Medrash says, and force him almost to take Yocheved back as a wife. So even someone of Amram's caliber was dispirited from continuing normal family life. The Haggadah quotes a pasuk in Shmos, Vayar Elokim es b'nei Yisrael vayeda Elokim. Certain phrases in this pasuk may be suggestive of God particularly keying in on the disruption of family life, whether it's B'nai Yisrael, the term B'nai Yisrael, that it was harder to bring children into the world, or whether it's the term Vayeda Elokim, which is a euphemism for sexual interaction, like Adam Yada Chava. But this was particularly upsetting. This was particularly a warrant for redemption. We may not have deserved it based on our religious performance, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu desired the proliferation of the Jewish people, and the moment that the Egyptians interrupted or impeded that progress, so redemption became a warrant, redemption became a mandate. The Es Amolenu Elu Habanim, not just the persecution and enslavement of the Jews, but the hatred, the cruel and unusual manner by which the Jewish children were thrown into the Nile River, were slaughtered for Paro's medical therapy, the blood that he was told to bathe in to heal his tsaras, or included in the bricks and mortar. So many different stories about not just hatred of Jews, punishment of Jews, imprisonment of Jews, but just cruel and hostile and monstrous and unspeakable horrors, reminiscent really of the Holocaust, that displayed the hatred that the Jews faced because they were chosen by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that forced HaKadosh Baruch Hu to redeem a people who may not have deserved that redemption. And then finally, Vayaras Anyenu, who recognized the hindering of Jewish family life, as Amalenu, the attack and the assault on our children, Mislachatzenu. And Chazal don't interpret this merely as pressure, but as religious pressure, forcing Jews to convert, or at least seducing, compelling Jews to convert to this ugly world of paganism. This three-part combination: A, the disruption of family life; B, the hostile, cruel, monstrous treatment of our children; and C, the effect and the impact this had on our own religious lives, almost forced HaKadosh Baruch Hu to redeem us, even though we may not have deserved that redemption on our own. So the third pasuk of Arami Ovid Avi describes this renaissance of prayer, even if it isn't the classic prayer, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu responding because of Zchus Avos, because of three aspects of the suffering, even though we may not have deserved the Geula on our own merit.